Everybody, and good evening, everybody, and welcome to this, the latest in Liverpool Hope University's events for Black History Month. The Black History Month at Liverpool Hope University has been organised by the Students' Union, by the History Department, and by the Social Science School. And tonight is the first event put on by the School of Social Sciences, so welcome to that. This evening, we are really proud and honoured to have Emi Onuora with us this evening in an event that is jointly hosted between ourselves and Writing on the Wall in Liverpool. Emi is going to speak about, this evening is going to speak about one of his books, The Great War to Race Riots, the history of the 1919 Liverpool race riot. But Emi himself has published wider than that. He's also the author of Pitch Black, A History of Black Footballers in Britain, and he's currently undertaking a PhD on race equality in football at John Moores University. So it's a great honour to have Emi with us. Emi's going to speak for about 30 minutes. And as he's speaking, if you think about any questions or you've got anything that you want to ask him, if you look at the bottom of your screen, there should be a button that says Q&A. And if you just type your questions into there, then I will gather them. And after Emi's spoken for about 30 minutes, we'll take the questions as they come along there. In total, this meeting will not last more than an hour. I think an hour on Zoom is probably about the maximum for anybody. So we will be finishing by 8 o'clock at the latest, and we'll end up by giving Emi some time to sort of sum up as well. So that's roughly how we will run it. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Emi. And as I say, Emi will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have lots of time for questions. Emi.
Thank you very much, Michael. Hopefully, people will enjoy the presentation. I've got some slides for everybody to look at. It's always useful to have something visual in these things. So hopefully people will get an opportunity to see the slides. I'm hoping that that's up and people can see that. Okay, hopefully. Give us a thumbs up if that's okay. Yes, good. Okay, so I just want to talk about as Michael said, about the Liverpool race riots of 1919, and it might surprise people to realise that actually, surely there's somebody sitting there thinking, well, surely that's the wrong date for race riots to occur in Liverpool, but actually, there were a series of race riots across Britain in that particular year, all focused around UK seaports. And what I want to do is really talk about the specific race riots that occurred in Liverpool, to put them into their kind of historical context and their social context, and really talk about what emerged from it and what lessons we can learn from it about it today, or what the legacy of those riots are all about. So hopefully you will enjoy the presentation. As I said earlier, there were riots in 9 port cities across the UK. They're not the first. They're probably not the first race riots. Other race riots have been documented, but they were the first really extensive set of riots that we've seen in the UK. And what there isn't a history of, unlike say in the US, is whole-scale kind of race riots that occurred, and these are the first race riots that occurred in the UK that were anything akin to the kind of race riots we know and we understand that have occurred in the United States. The race riots, and specifically the Liverpool race riots, in them, we had the first documented racist murder in Britain. We're not sure whether it was the first ever racist murder or not, but it was certainly the first documented racist murder in the UK. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But the race riots themselves have got to be seen in the context. It took place in 1919, just after the First World War, and certainly the social impact of the First World War hadn't died down at all by 1919. and it was a period of social unrest and upheaval and world wars. Both world wars have all culminated in a great deal of social unrest and upheaval as a consequence of them. So it occurs in the context of a great deal of social unrest and upheaval, which I'll talk about a bit later, but also occurred in relation to the competition for jobs as well, which I'll elaborate on a bit further. And these riots that took place in Liverpool and other parts of the UK had a profound impact on Britain's colonies. So just to give a kind of overview of the race riots, these riots occurred in UK seaports between January and August of 1919. The first ones occurred in Glasgow. There were also race riots in Tyneside, Newport, Cardiff. The one that's missing there from that list is in Barry Island in South Wales. Liverpool, Canning Town, specifically in East London, Salford and in Hull. During the same period of time, there were 26 race riots took place in that year in the USA as well, and all of the riots themselves involved thousands of whites pitted against dozens of blacks. The US race riots I'll talk about, a little bit about later on, but there were quite ferocious race riots insofar as 5 men, 3 whites and 2 blacks kind of lost their lives, with dozens injured and over 200 arrests being made as a result of those riots in 1919. So just to give you some background and context to the Liverpool riots. From the late 19th century onwards, the number of blacks in the city was increasing. Liverpool had been Liverpool as the oldest documented black community in Europe. Actually, its position as a seaport, as the most important seaport of the British Empire, meant that that generations of black people came to this country and came to Liverpool in particular and settled within the city. And the area in which they settled, for people who know the city reasonably well, is in present day Chinatown and present day Baltic Triangle, and that's the area that was colloquially called Sailor Town, an area of a melting pot, actually a cultural and ethnic melting pot where people from all over the world came to kind of settle. Each major port city across the world has its kind of sailor town, which developed in those areas, which were kind of culturally and ethnically diverse, whereby there were a whole load of lodging houses, drinking dens, gambling dens, and so on and so forth. All, there were similar areas in every kind of port city. And in Liverpool in particular, the black community first emerged from people who were sold as slaves, also people who were freed slaves, people who came to the city as seafarers, and Liverpool remained Liverpool's black community remained a seafaring community up until the Second World War. And also, people like dozens or hundreds, I should say, of freed slaves who fought for the British against the Americans in the War for Independence, who were promised their freedom and ended up on the losing side, came to Liverpool, and many are buried in St. Nicholas Church. So the Liverpool's black community is a kind of long-standing historic one as well. So so that's the kind of context for the background of the community. Bringing it a little bit more up to date, towards going further towards 1919. A Siemens Strike of 1911 was a fierce national strike over the use of non-unionized labor, and the And what was struck in the deal that was struck in the end was by the 1911 Siemens Strike, ended the practice of white and black seamen being paid the same rates. And the way that happened was that black seafarers were not allowed to join the union. So effectively what you had were non-union and unionized rates of pay, with all the black workers not allowed to join the union, and therefore being paid at lower rates than the black workers. Now, the reason why this is important is because later on, it led to a situation where black seafarers were used as cheap labor and were effectively so employers were effectively undercutting the price of labor by using black labor because it was cheaper, as a result of what the Siemens Strike had done. And that led to competition and racial tension as well, which were one of the kind of trigger factors for eventually the riots taking place in 1919. So companies like Elder Dempster extensively employed African and West Indian sailors, paid them and were able to pay them at a cheaper rate than white sailors. So they were able to undercut the wages effectively of white seafarers. Okay, so leading up to the First World War, World War I brought huge diversity to European lands. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the First World War and the position of black workers in the First World War, because it helped to fuel some of the resentment and had a massive impact on Britain's colonies. The treatment of black workers in the war, colonial workers in the war, in the First World War, was a really important factor in fueling resentment within Britain's colonies. So what you had was England and France very quickly made the decision to deploy colonial troops in Europe, although the British were far more reluctant than the French to do this. The British didn't like the idea of black troops fighting and shooting at white troops, even if those white troops were the enemy. They didn't like the idea, and the reason for that was to do with colonial myths, racist kind of ideas, all of those kind of sentiments that occurred in colonial times. But nonetheless, when it became clear that because of course some people in the British establishment argued that they needed as many troops as they could get, and those voices were the ones that won out in the end. So what we saw was a total of 140,000 Indian men were set to fight in France, and West Indian troops also saw action, although it wasn't the plan for black troops from the West, for troops from the West Indies and Africa to kind of see action in Europe, although they did see action in Africa. It wasn't the plan, but eventually that did occur. Some black troops did see action. In World War I, soldiers from Britain's African colonies, from Nigeria, the Gambia, Rhodesia, current day Zimbabwe, from current day Malawi, and from what was then the Gold Coast and is now Ghana, as well as South African, Sierra Leonean, and Ugandan soldiers, were all served as soldiers within the First World War, something that actually isn't particularly well known. So 55,000 African men served as soldiers, hundreds of thousands more served in auxiliary roles as well as carriers and laborers. Don't think that these roles weren't dangerous. They were very dangerous. It was trench digging. It was laboring roles, often under heavy enemy fire. These were particularly dangerous roles. and over 10,000 Africans were killed or died while serving. And significantly, of those Africans, 166 Africans were decorated, received various forms of decoration. Also in the labour units I talked about earlier, 60,000 black South Africans and 120,000 other Africans all served in uniformed labour units as well. So quite a significant presence of colonial troops contributed to the war effort. And just amongst Indian troops alone, 1.5 million Indian troops fought and saved Britain in the First World War. And financially, West Indian colonies contributed £2 million and India £200 million to the war effort. I don't know what that's worth in today's money, but it's significant. And so the contribution from the colonies was substantial. And so because of that, and the treatment which I'll explain a bit later on, because of that helped fuel a great deal of resentment in the colonies themselves. In particular, seafarers, and it's worth pointing out that it's important it's important to understand the role that seafaring played in the development of the riots. Indian seafarers made up 20% of British maritime forces by the end of World War I, so that was quite significant as well. Indian seafarers were described are called Lascars, and over 3,000, almost 3,500 died in conflict. 1,200 taken as prisoner during the conflict itself, and various seaports across the country were often places where Indian seafarers were housed, and not only housed in kind of temporary accommodation, but actually stayed and built communities there in those areas and other seafaring towns. So by the end of World War I, over 50,000 Lascars had settled, or Indian sailors had settled across the UK. We always think of Indian community and the West Indian and African community being a kind of post-Windrush, post-Second World War communities, but as we can see, the substantial Indians and Africans and West Indians settling in the UK prior to the Second World War. And so strong interracial communities established in Britain's major seaport towns. So just to give some kind of social and economic context to the riots themselves, after the end of the war, you have a shrinking of the economy. The economy is on a war footing. Those war industries are shrinking, followed by a recession. Merchant shipping, in particular, which was booming at the time of the First World War, now begins to contract to adjust to kind of peacetime conditions. Massive social unrest from a number of sources. The treatment of working class troops who served in the war. Hopefully most people are familiar with the carnage that occurred in theatres of war like the Somme, Passchendaele, Ypres, and Flanders. Are kind of familiar with some of the stories there. It created a whole great deal of dissatisfaction amongst kind of working class troops. And this dissatisfaction was often expressed through racist tension and violence. Also, at the same time, the British establishment had seen events in 1917 in Russia, where we had the Russian Revolution. Similar revolutions taking place in Germany, Austria, and Hungary, and the British establishment really feared kind of Bolshevik-style revolutions. 2000, lots of strikes, lots of mutinies at the time, and at the same time, you've also got thousands in Glasgow, people in Glasgow on strike, demanding a 40-hour week. In the States, you have race riots and lynchings in 26 US cities, provoked by the return of black uniformed service personnel who come back from Europe in their uniforms. The idea of black servicemen wearing military uniforms is an affront to many people, not just in the South, in the US actually, also in areas, parts of the North, and that leads to race riots and lynchings across the US. British West Indies Regiment mutinied for 3 days while it was stationed in Italy in early 1919, and at the end of the war there was a victory march in London for all colonial service, for all colonial servicemen, and Indian, West Indian and African servicemen are not allowed to participate in the victory march in London. Quite an affront to them, despite their contribution and their service, and despite the fact that large numbers of white South Africans, Canadians and Australians are allowed to participate in that victory march. And that's kind of part of one of the reasons why the contribution of colonial soldiers and sailors is kind of airbrushed out of history. Okay, so moving on to the Liverpool race riots. Prior to the war, black workers in Liverpool are excluded from almost all but kind of low-paid employment. Mainly seafaring and allied kind of trades and jobs and so on. But at the outbreak of the war, black labourers are now in relatively well-paid roles in munitions factories, chemical factories, sugar refineries, cake mills, getting reasonably well-paid employment. For the first time, black seafarers are welcome in the Merchant Navy, as most of the white Merchant Navy seafarers are needed by the Royal Navy. And therefore, as a result of the war effort, Liverpool's black population grew from an estimated 2,000 to 5,000 by the end of the First World War. So there's a rapid growth in the black population. And then what happens is that post-war, at the end of the war, post-war demobilization occurs, which results in literally thousands of destitute and unemployed soldiers now returning back to returning from France and other places. Now and with black labour far from being welcomed as it was at the start of the war, is now considered an impediment to work opportunities for white workers. And then what you see is a kind of systematic process of discrimination, where the colour bar is imposed and black workers are kind of thrown out of the roles and the jobs which they had. Just to give an example of that, 120 black workers are sacked from sugar refineries and other industries in just 1 week in 1919, and replaced by white workers. And also what occurs at the time is that white British sailors are given first preference for jobs. This is a kind of local arrangement. This isn't a national tendency. This is a kind of local arrangement that occurs, whereby white British sailors are given first preference for jobs, leaving white non-British sailors and black sailors in competition for the kind of few jobs that occur. And what that does is it means that there's a great deal of tension in Liverpool between particularly Scandinavian seafarers and black seafarers, because they're the ones competing for the kind of limited number of jobs. So what you have is a situation where black and Asian sailors and factory workers are thrown out of their jobs, and then suffer financial and economic hardship, evicted from their accommodation, and are living in credit and in poverty. So so much so that in May of 1919, the Liverpool Ethiopian Association appealed to the mayor of Liverpool on behalf of 600 discharged and unemployed black soldiers and seafarers, and asking for financial help and support or an end to the colour bar. At the same time, or later that month, the mayor receives a deputation from white workers claiming to represent uh, thousands of unemployed white workers, and they're complaining about the competition for jobs, the usual thing, blacks are taking our jobs, and so on and so forth. So there's growing racial tension within the city throughout May of 1919. On top of that, there's also the development of a lot of tension between the police and black community. There's raids on gambling houses where racial tensions take place. Quite often, it's the black workers who are arrested, or the police are kind of more ready to take the side of white workers in any kind of tensions that occur. So by the end of May, black men are repeatedly being attacked in the street. By the 4th of July, a West Indian, John Johnson, is stabbed in the face by two white Scandinavian men when he refused to give them a cigarette. This is kind of indicative of the racial tensions that had taken place. And as a result, 8 of his friends attacked the Scandinavian in a pub where they know that Scandinavians drink. 5 Scandinavians are hospitalized in the attack. And as a result, the police tried to arrest those black workers who've taken part in the pub fight, and they raid a series of boarding houses based in the city around the Docklands area. This included Upper Pitt Street, which is the home of Charles Wotton, who was a Bermudan fireman. He'd served in the Merchant Navy during the First World War. He's chased from his home by the police, who attempt to arrest him, and an angry white mob of up to 300 people. He's taken to the Queen's Dock. It's not really clear from police accounts exactly what happened to him, but from what we can surmise, the mob tore Charles Wotton from the police. From the 2 police officers who were chasing him, and threw him in the dock and threw into the Queen's Dock, threw rocks at him until he drowned. No arrests are made, and a later inquest put his cause of death as drowned, rather than what is in effect a lynching. And so this is kind of Britain's first documented racist murder. So over the next 5 days, there's mob rule on the streets of Liverpool. On June the 8th, 3 West Indians are stabbed and robbed. On the 9th and 10th of June, an estimated from media reports at the time, anywhere between 2,000 and 10,000, mainly young men, are roaming the streets around the Dockland areas, beating up black people and ransacking and burning the homes and businesses of black people. So boarding homes in Jackson Street, Dexter Street, Stanhope Street, Mill Street, and other areas are kind of set on fire and attacked. The people who are involved in the race riots are very largely drawn from the ranks of unemployed soldiers and sailors who see the black community as competition for jobs. And as a result of what goes on, black men, women, and children are forced to flee to police and fire stations, to church halls and other places of safety for their own safety, while the mob are kind of ransacking their communities and their homes. As a result, the police kind of failed to control the streets where rioting taking place. And incidentally, local and national newspapers, the Liverpool Chronicle and the Times, blame blacks for the rioting. citing interracial relationships, which seems to be kind of a feature of disgust at the time of the writers. Those places, as I said earlier, Dockland areas were kind of melting pots, and there was a lot of kind of interracial relationships formed. Liverpool has a strong history of interracial relationships between Black seafarers and Irish women. So there's got a long kind of history of those, and that was kind of one of the sticks with which to beat the Black community at the time. So let's look at some of the kind of official responses. The press called for the stern punishment of Black scoundrels, blaming Black workers, the Black communities themselves for the riots that had taken place. The police, in their kind of the police reports and the police evidence that they gave in local courts, took the side of the white mobs. Interestingly enough, the local courts took a different perspective and largely blamed the white mobs for making the name of Liverpool an abomination as well, and so on. Over the course of those days of rioting, 29 Blacks were arrested, 17 found guilty, and 12 were either found not guilty or freed without charge. 36 whites were arrested, all of whom were found guilty. Many received prison sentences as well. Officially, in terms of the response of the Colonial Office, there was a great deal of tension going on there, but which I'll touch on very, very briefly to give time for people to kind of ask questions. But the plight of Black men was highlighted in letters to the Colonial Office, particularly around men from Liverpool, Cardiff, and Glasgow. The Colonial Office acknowledged this situation of desperation as well, and condemned the role of the trade union, but could offer nothing except repatriation. And unfortunately, the response of the Home Office to this was to offer repatriation to those Black men and women, £5 and the embarkation to their country of origin. As a result, there were protest meetings in Hyde Park around the anti-Black riots of 1919 and the call for an inquiry into the death of Charles Wotton, which never materialised. The riots had a kind of key impact on the colonies. It kind of undermined the colonial ideas, and it also fueled civil and industrial unrest in the colonies themselves. So it undermined colonial ideas because although the repatriation program was put in place and they wanted rid of surplus Black labour, all of these men were British citizens, and the colonial ideals were that the sun never set on the British Empire, and all Empire citizens were also citizens of Britain, and so this was a kind of key strategy and a key ideal that justified colonialism and helped to maintain its principles. There was lots of civil unrest that took place across the colonies, in Barbados, in Jamaica, and in other colonies as well. The repatriation scheme was offered to all Black workers, but this included only their passage home. For many, they were in debt. They had, back rents to pay. They had other debts that they needed to pay, and many of them had wives and families. And the repatriation scheme only covered those men themselves. It didn't cover their children. It didn't cover their wives as well. So there was quite limited take up of of the repatriation scheme. So coupled with the events of 1919, the riots that took place, plus the treatment of colonial soldiers as well, this had a massive impact across the colonies themselves. In an uprising in Belize from those in the British West Indian regiment, from people who'd been saved in the British West Indian regiments. In Jamaica, there was also uprisings there, led by returning colonial soldiers. In St. Kitts as well, Barbados, Trinidad, and Belize, lots of riots taking place around the circumstances. Most of these servicemen went home to a worldwide economic recession, lack of opportunities. They felt hard done by. They'd saved Britain, but had been treated with contempt in return. And all of these events, in general, sparked off much of the independence movements that began to develop in the period immediately after the First World War, and after the Second World War. Most of those countries then gained the kind of independence. So, just for time's purposes, I will kind of just conclude my remarks and allow some questions. So just to conclude, that these riots occurred in a period of kind of social unrest on both sides of the Atlantic, and in fact all over the world. The riots occurred as a result of competition for jobs, compounded by the racism of the Siemens Union. What we saw as well was disinterest by the authorities, a little bit of tension between the Home Office and Colonial Office, because the Colonial Office were really concerned about how this might impact, or how it was impacting within the colonies. But largely there was a great deal of disinterest by the authorities to the plight of these communities and these men. What it also demonstrates is kind of clear evidence of a multiracial British community which predates the Windrush era. And also it demonstrates how Black communities prior to the Windrush era were overwhelmingly seafaring communities. If you think about the places where they settled, areas like Manchester, Birmingham, which we think of as being large areas where Black communities kind of reside today, weren't particularly seen as particularly important areas of Black settlement at the time. And just to finally say that the race riots of 1919 are not widely known, and it kind of adds to our knowledge of not only Black history, but colonial and British history as well. So thanks very much. I will end it there, and I'm happy to kind of take any questions.
Okay, mate, thanks very much. That was fascinating. I mean, not only the detail about what happened in Liverpool, but such a broad canvas to paint it on as well. So really very, very useful. I'm going to give people a couple of minutes to put some questions in. We've got a couple, and I'll give you a few minutes to get your breath back. I just want to tell those that are watching that that next week we have got 3 events at Liverpool Hope University for Black History Month. So next Tuesday, the Students' Union have organised an event with the She Rose charity, talking about their work in Malawi, and you can access that through the Hope Students' Union Facebook page. Next Wednesday, the History Department are hosting an event with Professor Hakeem Ade, the first Black history professor in the UK, and he'll be reflecting on his experiences there. And then next Thursday, the School of Social Sciences has got an event with Teo Aluko on Paul Robeson, Fighter for Liberation. So we will be putting out the Zoom codes for those on our social media, and we'll be delighted to see you there. Now, we've got some questions, Emmy. So the first one is, The first one comes from Bryce Evans in the History Department at Hope. And he asks, in 1915, there was some notable anti-German riots in Liverpool, which targeted German proprietors of pork shops. Can we distinguish between, on the one hand, the progressive tradition of rioting, the kind of rioting that's identified by Marxist historian E.P. Thompson as a form of popular protest and against profiteering, and on the other, the reactionary riots targeting people because of their race and ethnicity? And is there a way, he asked, that we can clearly distinguish between the two, or are the lines blurred, particularly given the context of popular patriotism whipped up by war? So quite a long question.
Okay, I think so. I think I've got it.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll take them one at a time because we've got a couple more. I've got another one there for you. So let me hand back to you, Amy, with that one.
Okay, I think we can distinguish between. I mean, my understanding of the 1915 anti-German riots was also to do with. Yeah, let me just go back a bit. I think obviously we can distinguish between reactionary riots and riots and riots that are done as an expression of discontent and with economic or social situations, I think. And I think you can distinguish between what you might describe, what very broadly we might describe as progressive riots and reactionary riots. However, riots kind of always seem to develop a kind of life of their own. And what you can't do with a riot is kind of control its form and its character. And so quite often, where riots might start as relatively progressive, there's no telling where the targets of those riots may be aimed at. And so what you get sometimes is those riots morphing into kind of quite reactionary ones, and the targets being, in the case of anti-German riots, or riots in particular in 1919, developing into anti-black riots. So what starts off in some of the port areas, what starts off as campaigns for better pay and better conditions and the relief of poverty, morph into anti-black sentiment. And so those riots kind of, as I said, take a life of their own and develop into quite reactionary ones. So hopefully that kind of answers some of Bryce's questions about it.
Okay. A couple of questions now, Amy. From first of all, from Mayuka Pele says, you said that when looking at World War I, it was mentioned that 166 Africans were decorated. What does decorated mean in this context?
Okay.
So that's the first one. And the second one is from Andy Castro. He says, is there any evidence of the Catholic Church or any of the religious organisations taking a position regarding the plight of the community at this time?
It's a great question, the one about decoration, because of course, what we mean by decoration in this context is the granting of medals for good service, typically for bravery. VCs and mentioned in dispatches as well was something whereby somebody's heroism was mentioned, but they didn't necessarily receive a medal. So I think in this context, what I mean by decoration is people being given service medals for bravery, usually for good service, and usually it would be for bravery, particularly under fire or for a variety of things. So what was the second question? It was about
the role of religious
religious organisations.
Yeah.
There's not a law, and certainly nothing from the Catholic Church. There was nothing from the Catholic Church at the time in Liverpool. So we haven't. I couldn't find any. I didn't specifically look for anything, but it'd be interesting to. But there wasn't anything that jumped out. While I wasn't specifically looking for anything on the reaction of the various churches, I didn't find anything, and that's probably because I don't seem to remember much being there actually in the research that I found. There was some from a Methodist church in Wavertree who wrote to the Lord Mayor in support of in support of the community, but it wasn't from what I can my understanding is there wasn't a coordinated campaign by any particular religious organizations to support the Black community at the time.
Okay, so let me just clarify. There's a couple of people asking, will the Zoom be available? So if you missed it at the beginning, let me just say that the event is being recorded, and probably the middle of next week, it will be available on the Liverpool Hope YouTube channel, and we'll certainly send that out so it will be there and available for watching after then. I've also got a couple of people saying they haven't got a question, but they just really enjoyed the session, so I thought I'd pass that on to you.
Thank you very much.
And a couple of questions. These are from anonymous attendees. So somebody, a question here: how should Liverpool reckon with its colonial and racist history? Should we be tearing down statues in the manner of the Bristol BLM protesters this summer?
Good
so
question.
That's the first one. Second one, do you think the rhetoric we see today about sending people back to where they came from and the idea that immigrants are taking jobs which should be for British people can be traced back to this period at the end of the First World War?
Okay. How should Liverpool and the UK recognise could you read that question out again, please, Michael?
Yeah, I can. So it was, how should Liverpool reckon with its colonial and racist history? Yeah, maybe my Glasgow accent. So should
no, I'm familiar with the Glasgow accent. Yeah, should statues be torn down?
Yeah.
I'm not in favour of statues being torn down. To state straight from the off, I'm not in favour of statues being torn down. I think in the case of the Colston statue, and I have to kind of declare a kind of interest because my niece who lives in Bristol was on that demonstration where the statue was torn down. I think there's two things that emerged out of the Colston statue, because actually what had happened for a long time in Bristol was that there was not just from the Black community but from others, people had wanted to acknowledge Colston as a slave owner and wanted to put a plaque that said Edward Colston, philanthropist, city father, and so on, and slave owner, but were never allowed to do so, and were never allowed to have that kind of discussion, actually. So the reaction to so when the opportunity arose, and this was a campaign that had occurred in Bristol for many years. So when the opportunity to pull the statue came, I suppose in the context of a protest around Black Lives Matter, it came down. But the good thing that emerged out of it is that actually now we do know that Colston was a slave owner, and we began to have a kind of conversation about Britain's colonial past and what is missing from British history, actually, and what's been airbrushed out of history. Liverpool, in particular, has a particularly extensive, history in relation to the colonies, in particular slavery. All of the main arteries in the city are named after slave owners. Lots of the streets in the city centre are named after slave owners. The city itself was built on the proceeds of slavery and slave cotton in particular. Bristol was more of a sugar city. And so the reckoning, as the questioner asks, is really about acknowledging Liverpool and the UK's. Cause it's not just a Liverpool issue; it's a UK issue. I mean, the slavery was the thing that actually was the catalyst for the Industrial Revolution. It was the thing that fueled the Industrial Revolution. It fueled our modern system of banking and insurance. So its legacy and its history is quite extensive. Without the proceeds of slavery, Britain wouldn't have been, the foremost kind of industrial power in the world. So the impact of slavery is quite important to the development of British history. So therefore, all these stories and this reckoning, as it's described by the questioner, is really important to have these conversations about the extent of it, about the extent of Britain's involvement in the colonies. And the other thing about the colonies as well, more specifically about the colonies, is that actually we don't know much about the colonies themselves, about how it was that Britain was able to have such an extensive colony that the British established called the British Empire, a place where the sun never set. So extensive was its influence. And what's not as well known, it's perhaps known that actually that colonial rule was held together under the barrel, at the point of a sword and a gun. And that occurred not only in India, which is probably the colonial location most well known, but also in parts of Africa as well, and in fact all over the colonial areas. The fact that there was extensive social movements to end colonialism and to instill independence in most of those countries, particularly after the Second World War, demonstrates how those people in those colonies actually viewed, or gives you an indication of how they viewed British colonial rule. And the other question was, what was that?
The other question was whether the sort of rhetoric about black people coming, taking our jobs, whether that we hear today, whether that can be traced back to the 1919 period or slightly further back from there.
That's a good question. That's a good question. I think while there's always been a community, there will always be. While there's always been a racist ideology, and the viewing of anybody, or viewing in particular black people and Asian people as outsiders, I think there'll always be viewed as competition for jobs in particular, but also, as we can see in the case of the 1919 riots, there's this idea of black people coming in, taking our women, and so on and so forth. The competition around interracial relationships is also kind of a factor that was in there, and it was actually one of I remember from the 70s, those kind of sentiments from far right organizations who used to state black people coming over here, taking our jobs, our homes, and our women, was also one of those kind of sentiments that was expressed right up into by the far right organizations, right up into as recently as the 1970s. So I think, so it's difficult to say where it actually emerged from, but certainly it was, I would argue that that idea that black people were outsiders and were in competition for jobs had been firmly established by the time the 1919 riots emerged, and was probably something that you could at least trace back to the 1911 seafarers strike, and I think it probably occurred before that. You see similar things as well happening when Eastern European Jews first came to the UK as well, where they were seen as kind of competition for jobs as well. So these kind of ideas that people come from abroad or outside and they're in competition isn't a kind of a new thing. And I don't think 1919 was the first time that these ideas occurred.
Okay, so we've now got a bit of a technical problem, which is that we've got lots and lots of questions and we are running out of time. So we've only got about 5, maybe stretched that
Always
into 10
takes a while
minutes.
for people to warm up.
10 minutes left. So I'm going to try and group some questions together, but they might come in a sort of broad umbrella, and you can sort of take them together. So one question that we've got here from Charlotte says, after the riots in 1919 ended, what was the atmosphere between people in Liverpool like? Did it get worse between different communities or did it get better? So that was Charlotte. That's maybe not exactly the same, but there's a similarity, a question from Guy Cuthbertson. He said, to what extent was the 1919 riot, was it in any way, did it in any way take place in relation to the peace celebrations? Because he says that in Luton Town Hall was burnt down on Peace Day in July 1919, and there were riots about the cost of peace celebrations in Coventry in the same year. So was there any element about that? And then there's a couple of questions. I'm going to use Judith as an example here. So Judith says that Charles Wotton's name is not even listed in any street, building, or noticeable location here in Liverpool. Should that not be given due consideration from a historical point of view? So I'll let you deal with those 3, and then I'll try and quickly get the rest together. And
Okay.
I'll have one more question for you after this.
Yeah, I don't think the peace celebrations they were a massive factor in terms of black service personnel feeling aggrieved that their contribution and their lives weren't kind of recognised and noted in their exclusion from that. But the peace celebrations were much more controversial in and of themselves at the time, because at a time of massive demobilisation, lots of soldiers and lots of people returning to destitution and unemployment, the peace celebrations cost an absolute fortune, and the British establishment felt the need to pay quite large sums of money on holding the peace celebrations, while at the same time people were destitute, and that explains some of the developments in Luton and in Coventry. Racial tensions beyond 1919. I think what happens in terms of racial tensions within the city is that they ebb and flow. So so racial tensions kind of go up and down throughout the course of history, and that sometimes it's better than at others, and at other times there's relative certainly in times of economic stability, then racial tensions are minimized, and at times of economic hardship, particularly when there's competition for jobs and other resources, then they grow. Then that enables racial tensions to be fueled. So I think in the immediate aftermath of 1919, there were still quite lingering racial tensions which took place, but over a period of time they kind of dissipated. I must say that within Sailortown, what was that area, that Dockland area that's kind of called Sailortown, people live in relative, I'm not saying everything's hunky-dory, but in relatively peaceful. Lots of ethnicities live, in relative harmony in those particular areas. And the final point about Charles Wotton is, yes, there probably should be something. There used to be, up until the 1990s, there used to be a Charles Wotton Centre, which was an adult education centre that was based in Liverpool. Later, it had various locations, but it was based in the Toxteth area. It had various locations, and finally, it was located in Upper Parliament Street. But eventually, it closed down. That particular facility closed down, and his name was kind of lost. There is a plaque that was placed there by the BBC, by David Olusoga, the historian, who placed a plaque there at the Queen's Dock, so you can go and see that. He placed a plaque at the site of the Queen's Dock, where Charles Wotton drowned. And so it would be great to see something. Interestingly, I've been in touch with family members from Bermuda. We know that he's buried in a pauper's grave in Anfield Cemetery, and what we want to do sometime in the near future is give him a headstone and bring his family members over.
Okay, so Emmy, so let me just to say to everybody else, apologies if there are still a lot of questions that we're simply not going to be able to get through. I've tried to give a flavouring of them, but I'm going to give Amy one final question, and this comes from Lindsay, who says, why do you think Black history has been so airbrushed out of history within the UK?
The reason, there's lots of reasons, but what, if you talk about Black history, then what you have to do is challenge the colonial narrative. So what happens is, the colonial narrative was that Britain were doing the rest of the world a favour. They had a civilizing influence. It was the white man's burden. It had a similar civilizing influence, and it gave Britain this influence throughout the world. Even as recently as the kind of late 70s, early 1980s, Margaret Thatcher talked about the impact of the colonies, and even more recently, David Cameron and Boris Johnson have talked about the good of Britain's colonial past. Reckoning and understanding Black history would challenge all of those kind of all those perspectives, and challenge what we understand and read in our histories as well. So the history that we learn, I mean, none of this I learned in school. It would challenge, students would also begin to challenge the history they had. And obviously other students would say, well, what about working class history? What about other histories of other marginalized groups and organizations? And so it probably challenges the kind of whole foundation of the history that we're on. So that's part of the answer, but time doesn't permit me to give a fuller answer, I'm afraid.
Okay. Amy, I've got a very short question just to finish off, and it's a straightforward one. I've got a number of people who want to read a bit more about it. So where can they get a copy of your book?
Okay, so you can get it on Amazon. That's probably the easiest place. It's called Great War to Race Riots. If you want a more generic history of Black Britain, Peter Fry's book Staying Power is still a really excellently researched piece of work, and you probably get it quite cheap now. I think it was written in 1984, but it's still pretty good.
And I presume you can get Great War to Race Riots down at News from Nowhere as well.
You can get it at News. You can get it. You can get it at News from Nowhere. Support your local independent booksellers. Yeah.
Okay, so just really, it's down to me then to thank Amy once again. Really enjoyable, really huge breadth of discussion as well. And I want to thank all the participants. It's been really well attended tonight and some really, really good questions. So thanks very much for watching. Thanks very much for asking the questions. More importantly, thanks very much, Amy, for giving us your time this evening. It's been fantastic.
Thanks very much.
Hope everybody enjoyed it. And final thing is, obviously there's the events next week, so we will be putting it out on Liverpool Hope social media, and hope to see some of you next week as well. Thanks very much.
Okay, thanks very much. Bye now.